Luca Bellini, a young and eager Swiss guard, has just completed his training at the Vatican's prestigious academy. He is assigned to his first major duty, a role that not many have undertaken before him. With his family's legacy of serving the church, Luca feels both honored and nervous as he steps into the sacred halls of the Vatican, not fully aware of the significance of the task at hand. Luca's assignment is to guard an ancient and forbidden chamber deep beneath the Vatican, known only as the Chamber of Silence. It is a place so secretive that even the most senior cardinals do not speak of it. Its entrance is concealed, and its existence is considered a rumor by many. Luca is told that no one is to enter the chamber, no one is to look inside, and most importantly, no one is ever to question its purpose. As Luca learns the rules of this sacred duty, he begins to uncover hints of a chilling history surrounding the chamber. He is introduced to Commander Romero, the senior officer in charge of the Swiss guards stationed at the Vatican, who gives him a strict warning. Curiosity has claimed many guards before you. Don't let it claim you as well. The reader is introduced to the tight security protocols surrounding the chamber, as well as the profound sense of responsibility that comes with guarding it. Luca, a young man filled with faith and ambition, feels an overwhelming weight of duty settle on his shoulders as he begins his watch over the chamber. Little does he know, this assignment will change the course of his life forever. Luca stood at the grand entrance of the Vatican, the ancient stone walls towering around him like silent witnesses to the centuries of history that had unfolded in these very halls. His breath came in steady bursts as the morning air swept through the courtyard. Today marked the beginning of his service as a Swiss guard, a duty so revered, so filled with the weight of responsibility, that he could hardly believe it was finally his turn. He looked down at his uniform, blue, white, and gold, carefully pressed and immaculately kept. To wear the uniform was to become part of the ancient institution of the Vatican, a tradition dating back to 1506. But today, something was different. Today, Luca was about to begin a duty unlike any other, one that few men in history had ever undertaken. It was a duty whispered about in the shadows, cloaked in mystery. It was a duty that few could even speak of, one that held secrets so dark and dangerous that even the most revered cardinals would never dare to utter its name aloud. Sergeant Bellini, the deep voice of Commander Romero, called out as he approached, his footsteps echoing in the vast, echoing halls. "You have been chosen for a special duty." Luca straightened, his chest swelling with pride as he snapped to attention. "Yes, Commander." Romero's eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Luca to follow him down a narrow, dimly lit corridor at the far end of the Vatican's underground levels. The walls here were different, older, worn with time, and filled with a weight that Luca couldn't place. "Come," Romero said, "your service begins today." They walked in silence for several minutes, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on Luca's chest. He had heard rumors, whispers of an ancient chamber hidden beneath the Vatican, of relics and artifacts that no one, not even the cardinals, dared to speak of. His family, long-serving guards, had always warned him about the Chamber of Silence, but even they never spoke of it directly. There were only the vague hints and cryptic warnings. Finally, they arrived at a heavy iron door, tucked away behind a forgotten alcove. The door was unlike any Luca had seen before, dark oak with intricate carvings, reinforced with black iron that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. "This is it," Commander Romero said quietly, his voice laced with an almost reverent tone. "This is the Chamber of Silence." Luca's heart skipped a beat as he stood before the door. It was beautiful, yes, but the air around it was thick with something else, something he couldn't quite identify. Fear, respect, or something darker. It was almost as though the door itself was alive, watching him, waiting for something. "You will be guarding this chamber," Romero continued. "You are to keep the secrets within. No one is to enter. No one is to speak of it. If you do, you will face consequences you cannot imagine." Luca nodded solemnly. "Understood, sir." Romero's gaze softened, though the warning in his eyes remained. "You are new to this duty, Luca, but I'll tell you this. The rules are simple. The moment you break one, the consequences will be swift. There are those who have tried to breach these walls. They are no longer here." Luca swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. He had heard the rumors of guards who had gone mad, of priests who had been silenced forever for attempting to breach the chamber's secrets. But what was so dangerous about this room? What could possibly be hidden within that would inspire such fear in the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church? Romero's voice broke through his thoughts. "There is an ancient truth hidden in that chamber, one that has been protected for centuries. The Church has preserved its secrecy not because of its power, but because of its consequences. You will not understand it all now, but you will learn. Guard this place with your life, Luca." Luca nodded once more, his heart pounding. He had heard of the Vatican's many secrets, but this felt different. This felt like a truth too powerful to be known by the world. Romero turned to leave, but then stopped and looked back at Luca. "One last thing," he said, his voice low and filled with a somber warning. "Do not let curiosity consume you. Many have fallen because of it." Luca's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew the stakes were high, but he hadn't yet realized just how much he was about to lose. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside, and with it, the weight of 1,000 secrets that Luca was now bound to protect. The next few days were spent in a haze of training, introductions, and learning the ins and outs of his new role. Sergeant Bellini was now a keeper of secrets. His shift was to be long and solitary, with only brief interludes of contact with other guards. The chamber was to remain sealed at all costs, and Luca was to keep a constant vigil. The rules were strict and unforgiving. 1. No one enters, no exceptions, not even high-ranking church officials. 2. No one looks inside. The door remains sealed unless relieved by another guard. 3. No discussion. Talking about the chamber was forbidden, an automatic dismissal for any guard who broke this rule. 4. Absolute silence. Even a whisper about the chamber could lead to consequences. As Luca stood before the massive door each night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the other side. The air around the chamber felt thick with anticipation, and the darkness beyond the door seemed to beckon him. But he had a duty, an unbreakable oath to protect what lay behind that door. And so, for now, he stood in silence, waiting for the next chapter of his life to unfold in the shadow of the Chamber of Silence. As Luca settles into his role guarding the Chamber of Silence, the weight of the task begins to sink in. The ancient chamber, so secretive and heavily guarded, is rumored to house an artifact of unspeakable power, a relic of unimaginable significance that must never be seen by mortal eyes. The more Luca learns about the chamber's origins and its hidden history, the more his curiosity deepens. He befriends an older guard, Giovanni, who has served at the Vatican for decades, hoping to shed light on the mysteries surrounding the chamber. Giovanni shares cryptic warnings about previous guards who were driven to madness by their encounters with the chamber, and others who mysteriously disappeared under troubling circumstances. Despite the warnings, Luca's fascination with the artifact inside the chamber grows, and he begins to question the true purpose of his post. The days dragged on in a monotonous, solitary rhythm. Luca stood guard at the entrance to the chamber, his eyes fixed on the massive oak door, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay behind it. The silence was deafening. Each night when the whispers from the chamber began, Luca tried to push them from his mind. But as time passed, he found himself more and more drawn to the door. The rules were clear. No one enters, no one looks inside. But why? It was his second week standing guard, and despite the strict training and orders, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important hidden within the chamber, something that even the highest-ranking cardinals feared. One evening, while sitting alone in the guardroom after his shift, he caught sight of Giovanni, an older guard who had been stationed in the Vatican for over 30 years. Giovanni was a man of few words, but his deep-set eyes and the slight tremor in his hand when he spoke made Luca uneasy. He had heard rumors about Giovanni, the whispers of an old guard who had once been a legend among the Swiss guards. Luca approached him cautiously. "Giovanni," he began, his voice low, "do you know anything about the chamber, about the artifact inside?" Giovanni looked up, his face weary, his eyes scanning Luca's for any sign of weakness. He motioned for Luca to sit across from him. "Why are you asking about the chamber?" Giovanni's voice was gravelly, as if the mere mention of it caused discomfort. Luca hesitated but then spoke. "It's just the silence, the rules. I don't understand why we guard it so fiercely. There must be something inside worth protecting." Giovanni leaned forward, his face tightening. "You don't understand the weight of the secrets the Vatican carries. That chamber is no ordinary room. It holds something so powerful, so dangerous, that not even the cardinals dare speak of it." Luca felt his pulse quicken. "What is it? What's inside?" Giovanni shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with something Luca couldn't quite identify. Fear, guilt. He seemed to weigh his next words carefully. "All I can tell you is this. There have been guards before you, good men, loyal to their duty, who went mad simply because of the whispers from that chamber. Some disappeared without a trace, their names erased from the records." Giovanni paused. "I'm not saying you will, but you can't fight the pull. It gets inside you." Luca felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard rumors of former guards who had lost their sanity, but Giovanni's words struck deeper than anything he had imagined. What could possibly be inside to drive a person mad? The curiosity gnawed at him, but he forced himself to stay focused on his duties. Giovanni leaned back, his hands shaking as he clasped them together. "You want to know what's inside, don't you? That's what I thought. But listen to me, Luca. Whatever you do, don't fall into the same trap we all did. The truth will consume you, and there's no way out once you open that door." Luca nodded slowly, a knot forming in his stomach. He wanted to ask more, but the look on Giovanni's face made him hesitate. Giovanni had already said more than he should have. It was clear that the guard's mind had been shaped by the years spent in service of such a secret. The truth, whatever it was, had left its mark. The next night, as Luca stood before the chamber of silence, his mind was still haunted by Giovanni's warning. The door loomed in front of him, its ancient carvings glistening in the dim light of the corridor. The whispers had started again, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls. They were familiar now, but still unsettling. Luca couldn't help but wonder, what was it about this artifact that made it so dangerous? What could possibly justify the secrecy and the unyielding guards surrounding it? As the hours passed, Luca's thoughts wandered, but he stayed vigilant. He knew the rules. He had been taught them from the moment he arrived at the Vatican. Do not look inside. Do not speak of it. Do not question it. Yet the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the voice inside his mind telling him there was something more, a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. Later that week, Luca was alone in the guardroom when he noticed a set of old documents hidden in a drawer, left behind by the previous guard. These were records, scribbled notes in Latin, old maps and references to an ancient relic. Curiosity took hold, and Luca began to sift through the pages, his eyes scanning the lines. The documents described the origin of the Chamber of Silence, a place constructed centuries ago in the wake of the Council of Trent. The chamber was built to house a sacred artifact, one said to contain the very power of creation and destruction. The documents were written in cryptic language, but Luca could decipher a few key passages. The artifact has the power to reshape the fabric of the world, a relic sealed away to prevent its misuse. He read further, his heart pounding, but the text grew more fragmented and illegible the deeper he went. There were references to ancient rituals performed to protect the artifact, rituals that were never fully described. But one thing was clear: the Vatican had gone to great lengths to ensure the artifact's power was never unleashed. Luca closed the papers quickly, his hands trembling. What he had uncovered only deepened the mystery. He glanced at the door of the chamber. What if he had only scratched the surface of a truth so ancient and dangerous that even the cardinals feared it? His curiosity now burned brighter than ever, but the warning Giovanni had given him echoed in his mind. Don't fall into the trap. Luca looked at his watch and then at the door. He had a duty. But now, more than ever, his duty seemed like a prison. Luca's first night on duty guarding the Chamber of Silence is filled with strange and unsettling noises, whispers, distant crying, and laughter that seems to come from nowhere. At first, he brushes it off as nerves, a natural reaction to the responsibility of his first solo night watch. But as the hours drag on, the sounds grow louder, more distinct, and more unnerving. He feels a mounting sense of dread, unable to shake the feeling that something inside the chamber is aware of his presence. The chamber, which had been eerily quiet during the day, comes alive with noise at night, and Luca begins to question his sanity as the sounds seem to surround him. His attempts to stay focused on his duties are increasingly thwarted by the growing intensity of the sounds, leading him to the edge of his own fear. The cool, crisp air of the Vatican's lower levels sent a chill through Luca's spine as he descended into the dimly lit corridor. He was alone, just as he would be for the next several hours, standing guard before the Chamber of Silence, where he had been assigned his first solitary night watch. It was early evening when his shift began. The sounds of tourists and staff above in the Vatican echoed faintly, but the lower levels where the chamber was housed were eerily quiet. Silence, Luca thought. It was the only word he could think of to describe the atmosphere here. The first few hours of his watch were uneventful. He stood still, his mind quiet, his eyes focused. There were no disturbances, just the gentle hum of the ancient stone and the soft flicker of the overhead lights. But as the clock ticked past midnight, the silence that had enveloped him seemed to crack ever so slightly. It was subtle at first, just a whisper. Luca glanced around, but there was no one there. It must have been his imagination, he thought, shaking his head and trying to focus on his duty. The whispers grew louder. Whispers, indistinguishable from one another, but there were voices. A chorus, if you could call it that, soft, unintelligible words that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the corridor. It was as though the chamber itself was alive, speaking, breathing, and waiting. Luca stiffened. He turned his head toward the door, his breath catching in his chest. The door was still sealed, just as it should be. Yet the voices seemed to come from inside. He swallowed hard. "Get a grip, Luca," he muttered to himself, as if hearing his own voice could break the tension. He shifted his weight and looked down at his halberd, running his hand along its cold metal shaft for comfort. The silence returned, but it was thick and suffocating now, heavy in the air. Luca shook his head again, trying to force the thoughts away. This was his first night, his first watch. The Chamber of Silence was known for its eerie atmosphere. He was just getting used to the pressure. It's just nerves, he told himself. But deep down, a part of him couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was different tonight. Something had changed. As the night wore on, the noises grew more intense. The whispers stopped, replaced by soft crying, a faint sound at first, like a person weeping quietly in the next room. It wasn't loud enough to make out any words, but the sorrow was palpable. A mother, a child. The sound seemed to move through the walls, reverberating all around him. Luca's pulse quickened. He pressed his hand to his temple, trying to stave off the growing sense of dread that began to suffocate him. He had heard the stories of previous guards losing their minds, the whispers, the sounds, the overwhelming sensation of being watched. They were always told in hushed tones, never spoken of in public. But now, standing in the dark corridor with the noise creeping into his ears, Luca felt it. It wasn't just the sound. It was the silence that followed, the deep, crushing silence that came after each crying episode, like a pause before something worse was about to happen. He found himself staring at the door of the chamber, as if the very darkness inside it were reaching out to him. He couldn't stop his heart from racing. Just as Luca steadied himself, the laughter came. At first, it was faint, like distant echoes of a celebration or joy that felt too out of place in the dark, hollow corridors of the Vatican. But as the laughter continued, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human. It was a strange, inhuman sound, a chorus of high-pitched giggles and deep, throaty laughs that seemed to merge together in an eerie cacophony. Luca gripped the halberd harder, feeling the cold metal bite into his palm. He clenched his jaw, his eyes locked on the door. Where was it coming from? His eyes darted nervously around the dark corridor, but he saw nothing. The chamber, that dark place of secrets and silence, was still locked, still sealed. He swallowed, his throat dry, as the sound of laughter grew louder still. It felt as though it was coming from inside his own mind, playing tricks on him. The air grew thick with tension, and for a moment he almost felt like he wasn't alone anymore. Luca fought to stay alert, but the growing sense of panic began to claw at him. Was he losing his grip on reality? Was he truly hearing these sounds? He checked his watch. The time seemed to have dragged on, and it felt as though he'd been standing there for hours, listening to the unsettling sounds that surrounded him. The whispers had come back again, barely audible but unmistakable. They seemed to be following a pattern now, growing louder, more chaotic, and then stopping suddenly, only to return even stronger. The laughter continued, mixing with the whispers in an unsettling symphony. Luca wanted to look away, to turn his back on the door and escape the suffocating atmosphere, but he knew better. His training kicked in. No movement, no distraction, keep your focus. And so he stood there alone in the dark, surrounded by the sounds that had no clear source. He tightened his grip on his halberd again, but this time it didn't comfort him. The door was still sealed. He hadn't broken any rules. He hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. Yet deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that the chamber, that thing inside, was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. As the night wore on, Luca's mind became increasingly clouded. The sound seemed to seep into his consciousness, infiltrating his thoughts. He found himself losing track of time. The air around him felt thick and oppressive. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, pounding in sync with the whispers and laughter. Finally, the sound stopped. All at once, the whispers, the crying, the laughter, they all ceased. Silence. But this silence was different from the quiet of earlier in the night. It was a heavy silence, a silence that seemed to fill the corridor with a sense of foreboding. Luca's breath came shallow, his chest tight. He glanced around the dark corridor one last time, his eyes darting back to the door. For a fleeting moment he thought he saw something moving behind the solid oak. Just a shadow. The sudden clicking sound of his radio broke the silence. "Sergeant Bellini, this is command. Status report." Luca jumped, his heart racing as he pressed the button. "All quiet, command. Everything is normal." "Copy that, Sergeant. Relief is scheduled for 0600 hours. Keep up the good work." "Understood." The radio clicked off and Luca was left alone again in the quiet. He stared at the door of the chamber, but now it didn't seem so imposing. The noise, the tension, it was over, for now. But the lingering feeling of being watched stayed with him. He glanced at the clock again, only a few hours left of his shift. The whispers, the laughter, the cries. They would return, and this night, just like the last, would never be forgotten. Luca's vigil at the Chamber of Silence continues without incident. Until one evening, a high-ranking official, Cardinal Vescari, arrives at the chamber's entrance, demanding to speak with him. Vescari is a man of great influence, a towering figure within the Vatican, but his demeanor is desperate, almost frantic. He asks to be allowed inside, pleading with Luca to break the rules, but Luca refuses, his resolve unwavering. As Vescari's desperation grows, he hints at a terrible fate awaiting the Vatican if the artifact within the chamber remains sealed. Luca, already torn between his duty and his curiosity, finds himself questioning everything he has been protecting. The tension between his moral compass and the strict rules he must follow escalates, forcing Luca to grapple with a choice that may alter the course of the Vatican's fate. Luca's shift began like any other evening. The quiet was thick in the corridors, the air cold and still. The faint hum of the Vatican's old ventilation system was the only sound that accompanied him as he stood guard, eyes trained on the chamber's massive oak door. The whispers, as they always did, seemed to drift in and out of his awareness, quiet for now, but ever present in the back of his mind. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, unexpected noise. Footsteps, heavy and measured, echoing in the stillness of the Vatican's labyrinthine hallways. Luca instinctively straightened, his hand gripping the halberd tighter. He wasn't expecting anyone. At this hour, the Vatican's halls were almost deserted. The man who appeared before him was dressed in the unmistakable robes of a high-ranking church official, the red of his vestments striking against the stone gray of the corridor. Cardinal Vescari. Luca had seen the cardinal before, his face appearing in the grand halls of the Vatican, often surrounded by other high-ranking clergy. Vescari was a man of authority respected by all, yet now his face was taut with urgency. There was an almost frantic look in his eyes, something Luca had never expected to see in a man of such high standing. "Sergeant Bellini," the cardinal began, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to speak with you, immediately." Luca's heart skipped a beat. No one was allowed near the chamber unless they were assigned to it. Cardinal Vescari's position in the church gave him immense power, but Luca knew the rules. He stood firm. "Your Eminence, I cannot let you through," Luca replied, his voice steady despite the unease in his chest. "The rules are clear. No one enters the chamber without authorization." Cardinal Vescari's eyes flickered with something Luca couldn't quite place, desperation, perhaps. "You don't understand," the cardinal said, his voice lowered but urgent. "You have to listen to me. I need access to that chamber. It's a matter of grave importance." Luca's grip on his halberd tightened, but he did not budge. "I cannot allow it, Your Eminence. The rules." "The rules," Vescari hissed, his voice rising sharply before he regained control. "The rules were set to protect the Vatican, Sergeant. Don't you see? What you're protecting inside that room is a danger, a threat to everything we stand for. If the artifact remains sealed, if it is not released, then it will bring about the end of the church as we know it." Luca felt a surge of confusion. He had always been told that the artifact inside was too dangerous, too powerful to be exposed. That's why the Vatican had gone to such extremes to keep it hidden. But now, Cardinal Vescari was suggesting that keeping it sealed might lead to even worse consequences. "What are you saying, Your Eminence?" Luca asked, his voice low but his mind racing. What could possibly be so dangerous about the artifact? And why are you, of all people, demanding access? The cardinal took a step closer, his voice trembling slightly now, as if weighed down by the enormity of what he was about to say. "You don't understand," Vescari whispered. "The artifact, it is not just an object. It holds the power to shape reality itself. I don't know how, but I know it is tied to the very foundation of the Vatican. The power inside that chamber could either save us or destroy us." Luca felt his pulse quicken, a creeping unease filling his chest. What was the cardinal suggesting? Was this a ploy to gain access to something that should never be touched? "I have followed the rules for years, Your Eminence, and I will continue to follow them. No one enters, that's the order." Vescari's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and fear. He lowered his voice, almost pleading. "Sergeant, you don't realize what's at stake. You think that the artifact is a simple relic, a relic of power, yes, but it is far more than that. It's a key to the true history of the church, one that we have buried for centuries. If it remains locked away, we may very well be sealing our own fate. The world is changing, and the Vatican must change with it. But if we don't act now, the church will fall into oblivion. The artifact will not remain hidden forever." Luca's mind swirled. The rules he had been sworn to follow were absolute. No one enters the chamber, not even high-ranking clergy. But here was a cardinal, a man of the highest standing in the church, imploring him to break the very rules that protected the sanctity of the Vatican. Luca was caught between his duty and his growing unease about what the cardinal was suggesting. "You ask me to break the rules," Luca said slowly, the weight of his words pressing on him. "To open the chamber, to risk everything we've worked to protect. I cannot do that, not without knowing more." Cardinal Vescari's expression softened, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his plea had drained him. "You're not just protecting the Vatican, Sergeant. You're protecting the truth about the Church's past. You think it's a secret. You think the cardinals have no idea what lies inside that chamber. We've all been complicit, but I can't stand by and watch the world burn because we're too afraid to face the truth." Luca felt torn. His mind screamed for him to uphold the vow he had made, to protect the chamber at all costs, but Vescari's words, filled with urgency and fear, gnawed at him. "What would happen, Your Eminence," Luca asked quietly, "if I were to let you in, if I were to break the rules?" Vescari's eyes hardened with resolve. "We may save everything we hold dear, or we may destroy it all, but I can't do it alone. You're the only one who can help." Luca stood motionless, his heart racing. He was a man of duty, a servant of the Church, sworn to protect secrets that no one should ever know. Yet now, before him stood a man who had wielded immense power within the Vatican for years, and he was asking Luca to betray that duty, to defy everything he had been taught. As Luca struggles with his growing curiosity and the pressure from Cardinal Vescari, he seeks out Giovanni, the retired guard, in hopes of gaining some clarity. Giovanni, a man who has seen decades of service at the Vatican, offers a chilling account of a previous guard who defied the rules and entered the Chamber of Silence. This guard's disobedience came at a terrible cost. He was driven mad by what he saw inside, and was ultimately executed by the Vatican. Giovanni's story serves as a stark warning to Luca about the dangers of curiosity and the inevitable consequences of questioning the Vatican's authority. The weight of obedience and punishment looms large as Luca begins to question whether the answers he seeks are worth the cost of his own sanity and life. Luca had spent the day walking the corridors of the Vatican in a daze, his thoughts consumed by the conversation with Cardinal Vescari. The weight of his duty felt heavier than ever. The rules he had sworn to uphold were more than just regulations. They were sacred, the bedrock of his service. Yet despite this, his curiosity about the Chamber of Silence gnawed at him relentlessly. He couldn't ignore the questions any longer. What was inside that room? Why did it have such power? And why had the Vatican gone to such lengths to keep it hidden? He needed to speak with Giovanni, the only one who had been there long enough to understand the true danger that the chamber held. Giovanni had been a Swiss guard for over 30 years and had seen things that Luca could barely begin to comprehend. Finding Giovanni wasn't difficult. He was a regular presence at the small chapel on the grounds, where the older guards went to pray and reflect. As Luca approached, he saw Giovanni sitting alone in one of the pews, his hands folded, eyes closed in silent prayer. The man looked ancient, his face lined with wrinkles and his hands rough from years of service. When he noticed Luca, he gave a slight nod and motioned for him to sit. "Giovanni, I need to speak with you," Luca began, his voice low and hesitant. Giovanni opened his eyes and regarded Luca with a gaze that seemed to see right through him. "You've been standing guard at the chamber, haven't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Luca nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "Yes, but I don't know what to think anymore. I'm struggling. The sounds, the whispers, it's more than I expected." Giovanni's face darkened at the mention of the whispers. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering even more. "The chamber doesn't just play with your mind, Luca. It breaks you. It twists the truth until you don't know what's real anymore." Luca felt his heart race. "What do you mean? What's inside that makes it so dangerous?" Giovanni sighed deeply, rubbing his worn hands together. "I've seen things I wish I could forget, But there's one story you must hear. It's about a guard much like you who made the mistake of breaking the rules." Luca leaned in, his curiosity overtaking him. What happened to him? Giovanni's voice became even more grave. His name was Antonio, a bright young man. He was eager, full of pride in his duty, just like you. But Antonio, he was like most of us when we were new, curious. He asked too many questions about the chamber. He became obsessed, and over time, he began to believe that he was the one who could unlock its secrets. The rest of us, we just tried to ignore the whispers to keep our minds focused. But Antonio, he couldn't let it go. Giovanni paused, his eyes narrowing as if he was reliving the moment. One night, Antonio was alone on guard. The chamber had been silent for weeks, but the whispers, they were louder than usual that night. He said they were calling him, calling his name. He couldn't resist. He opened the door. Luca's breath caught in his throat. He opened it. Giovanni nodded solemnly. Yes, he went inside, but when he came out, he wasn't the same. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His hands were shaking. He couldn't speak, couldn't form a sentence. The whispers had gotten inside him. They took his mind, twisted it. Luca's voice trembled. What happened to him? Giovanni's face hardened as he spoke. We tried to help him, but he couldn't hear us. He wasn't there anymore. What he saw inside, the relic, the power, the truth, it drove him insane. He began to scream, saying that he had seen the end of the world, that the Vatican would burn and that all of us would be destroyed if we didn't free the artifact. Luca's stomach turned. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. And then they took him, Giovanni replied quietly. At dawn, he was executed for breaking the rules, for opening the chamber. The Vatican doesn't allow disobedience, Luca. Not when it comes to the chamber. You know that. They don't make exceptions, no matter who you are. Giovanni's eyes met Luca's, a weight of sorrow in them. Antonio thought he could handle the truth, but he was wrong. The chamber is not just a room, Luca. It's not a relic. It's something far older, far darker. You can't just open the door and expect to control it. It controls you. Luca sat back, his mind spinning with the horror of what Giovanni had just revealed. But what was inside? What did he see? Giovanni's face grew somber. I don't know. No one knows. But I know this. The truth that lies inside that chamber, it isn't meant for human eyes. It's a truth so terrible it'll break you. Giovanni leaned back in the pew, his hands clasped together in a gesture of resignation. We guard the chamber not because we believe in its power, but because we must. It's our duty, Luca, just as it was Antonio's. We protect the secret even if it destroys us. Luca remained silent, his mind racing. The fear and the curiosity that had been building inside him were now at odds. He had wanted answers, but now those answers seemed like poison, too dangerous to handle. Giovanni's words echoed in his ears. Curiosity will destroy you. I don't know if I can do this, Luca said quietly, almost to himself. I can't stop wondering about it. The chamber, the artifact, what it all means. I feel like I'm losing control of my mind. You must not give in. Luca, you cannot break the rules. If you do, you will end up like Antonio. You'll lose everything you hold dear. The Vatican will not save you, and neither will God. Luca closed his eyes, the weight of Giovanni's warning settling heavily on his chest. His thoughts raced, trying to process everything. The consequences of defying the rules were more terrible than he could have ever imagined. As Luca continues his vigil at the Chamber of Silence, the unsettling noises grow more intense and personal. He begins to hear specific voices, first whispers of his own name, then his mother's voice calling to him from within the chamber. The whispers grow louder, more distinct, as if something inside the chamber is aware of his presence and trying to manipulate his emotions. The sounds torment Luca, pushing him to the brink of sanity as he struggles to resist the psychological warfare being waged on his mind. His sleep deprivation and deteriorating mental state make him question what is real and what is a product of the chamber's influence. He becomes trapped between his duty and the mounting pressure to give in to the voices and uncover the truth behind the chamber's power. It started subtly at first, a whisper in the darkness, barely perceptible, so faint that Luca thought it was the wind or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him. But over the past few nights, the whispers had grown stronger, clearer. Luca stood in front of the chamber's door, his heart pounding in his chest. The usual quiet had descended on the hallways, but now, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers began once more, rising in volume. At first, they were familiar, soft, almost comforting. The sound of his name, barely more than a breath against the stone walls. Luca. He stiffened, blinking hard, trying to push the sound away. Was he imagining it? It had to be his mind fraying under the pressure. But then it came again, clearer this time. Luca, come closer. He stepped back from the door, his heart racing. The words were unmistakable. They were calling to him, his own name, and the voice was too real to be a figment of his imagination. The chamber seemed to hum with a low energy now, almost as if it were alive, breathing, aware of his presence. Luca could feel it, a palpable, invisible weight pressing against his chest. The air grew heavy, thick with something he couldn't explain, and then the whispers turned to something darker. Luca, the voice faded, but another followed. This one was different. It wasn't just his name. It was his mother's voice. Luca, my son, come home. His breath caught in his throat. His mother, her voice, warm and comforting, came through the very walls of the chamber. He hadn't heard her voice in years, not since she had passed away when he was just a child. Yet here it was, calling to him, urging him closer. "Ease, Luca," the voice begged. "I'm waiting for you." Luca's hands began to shake. The memories of his childhood flooded his mind, the warmth of her embrace, the way she used to call him when he would wander too far from home. He could hear the soft rustle of her clothes, see the smile on her face. He had longed to hear her voice again, but this was wrong. Luca's pulse quickened. He turned away from the door, clutching his head, trying to push the voice out of his mind. No, this wasn't real. This wasn't her. The chamber had to be manipulating him, toying with his emotions, pushing him to the edge. But the voices didn't stop. They never stopped. The next few nights were even worse. The voices from the chamber began to torment him in ways he couldn't ignore. Luca started hearing more voices, some distant, some close, each trying to draw him in, pull him toward the door. Some sounded like loved ones, others like strangers, all desperately pleading for him to open the door. The voice of his mother was the loudest, the most persistent. It filled his thoughts when he closed his eyes, whispered in his ears when he tried to sleep. "Luca, please. You have to let me in." At times, it was almost unbearable. He could no longer distinguish the line between reality and the whispers inside the chamber. Was it truly his mother calling to him, or had the chamber distorted his memory, twisted his mind to break him? Luca's nights became long and restless. The fatigue set in, seeping into his bones and making his thoughts slower, his movements heavier. He hadn't slept properly in days. One night, after hours of hearing the whispering voices claw at his sanity, Luca snapped. The chamber's incessant calls had worn him down. He staggered to the door, compelled, as if his body were moving of its own accord. "Luca, you know what you have to do. It was his mother's voice again, full of pleading. Her words seemed to reach into his soul, twisting him into a state of confusion. The guilt, the grief, the memories, all tangled together in a cacophony of noise that threatened to swallow him whole. Luca stood in front of the door, his hand on the handle, the temptation pulling him closer, closer to the answers that he had longed for. The whispering voices were louder now, more distinct, as if they were standing right next to him. The artifact, the truth, they promised him all of it, if only he would just look inside. His vision blurred as he hesitated. The weight of his duty, the sacred vow he had sworn to protect the chamber, fought against the desperate need for answers that had taken root in his mind. Curiosity, Giovanni's warning, echoed in his thoughts, but this was something different. This felt real. The whispers, the crying, the laughter that had become so familiar, they were all a twisted manipulation. He knew it now. He had to resist. Luca backed away from the door, his breathing shallow, his chest tight. Sweat dripped down his face as he stumbled backward, feeling his mind strain under the weight of the mental assault. It felt as though something inside the chamber had a grip on him, pulling, haunting him, driving him to madness. He staggered to the corner of the corridor, closing his eyes, trying to shut out the voices. But the guilt, the fear, and the nagging curiosity festered within him. How long could he last? How much longer could he stand guard, knowing the chamber was calling to him, knowing the truth was just beyond the door? Father Alessio, a young priest who has recently arrived at the Vatican, approaches Luca with an unusual request. He wants to perform a ritual inside the Chamber of Silence. Father Alessio has been conducting extensive research into the origins of the chamber and its artifact, believing that the artifact holds the key to curing a deep spiritual crisis that the Vatican is facing. The young priest's obsession with uncovering the truth about the artifact grows, and he convinces Luca that the Vatican's very survival may depend on what lies inside the chamber. Torn between his sworn duty to protect the chamber and his own growing desire for answers, Luca faces a difficult choice. Ultimately, in a moment of weakness, he agrees to help Father Alessio, breaking his cardinal rule. But this decision begins to set in motion events that will alter the course of his life and the fate of the Vatican forever. It was the early hours of the morning when Luca heard the soft, echoing footsteps in the hall. He was alone, his mind still haunted by the voices and the oppressive silence of the chamber. His shift had been uneventful until now. The sound of footsteps grew louder, the steps purposeful and measured, as though the visitor knew exactly where he was going. Luca's instincts flared. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a priest, younger than most, with dark eyes that held an intensity Luca hadn't expected. His black robes were unassuming, but his presence commanded attention. Father Alessio. Luca didn't recognize him at first, but as the priest came closer, Luca noticed something familiar in his demeanor. Father Alessio was not just another Vatican priest. He had the air of someone who carried secrets, someone who had been involved in something dangerous. And there was something in his eyes that Luca couldn't place, determination, even obsession. Sergeant Bellini, Father Alessio greeted him with a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been looking for you." Luca studied the priest warily. "Is there something you need, Father?" "I need your help," Father Alessio said, his voice low and urgent. "It's about the Chamber of Silence." Luca stiffened at the mention of the chamber, the room that had consumed his every thought and guarded his every waking hour. He had sworn an oath to protect it, No one enters. No one looks inside. He couldn't imagine what this young priest could possibly want with such a forbidden place. "You must understand, Father, I cannot allow anyone inside the chamber. The rules are clear," Luca replied firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. Father Alessio didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, lowering his voice even more. "I know the rules, Sergeant, and I respect them, but I have a reason, one you may not fully understand yet." Luca hesitated, his fingers tightening around the halberd at his side. "What reason could there possibly be, Father? No one is allowed near it, not even you." Father Alessio's gaze hardened. "The artifact inside the chamber holds the key to the Vatican's survival, its spiritual survival. For years, the Church has been facing a crisis of faith, a weakening of spirit among the people. The Vatican is losing its power, but the artifact inside that chamber could cure the crisis if we use it correctly." Luca frowned, confused and skeptical. "And how do you know this, Father? What makes you so certain?" Father Alessio's expression darkened, as if a deep fear rested in his heart. "I've spent months researching the origins of the chamber. I've studied old texts, rituals, and records. The artifact inside is no mere relic. It's far more than that. It has the power to heal the deepest wounds of the Church, but only if it is released, and the time has come for the truth to be known." Luca stared at the priest, feeling an unsettling mixture of awe and suspicion. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "You can't truly believe this, Father," Luca said, shaking his head. "We've been guarding it for centuries. Why now? Why do you think it's the right time to open it?" Father Alessio's eyes softened for a brief moment, but the intensity in them never wavered. "Because we are desperate, Sergeant. The Vatican's power is waning. People are turning away from the faith. The artifact can revive the Church, but it cannot help us if it remains locked away." Luca felt a pang of doubt twist inside him. The rules were absolute, no exceptions, no deviations. He had sworn an oath. But Father Alessio's words made something inside him stir. Could the artifact really hold the answer? The days that followed were filled with dread and indecision. Luca couldn't escape Father Alessio's words. He had long suspected that something inside the chamber was more than just a relic. The whispers he had heard over the past weeks, voices, strange sounds, suggested that there was something alive, something aware behind those doors. The artifact, whatever it was, seemed to call to him. He found himself standing at the door of the chamber more and more often, his thoughts drifting to the ancient artifact that had been hidden for so long. What could it really do? Why had it been sealed away? Was Father Alessio right? Was the Vatican truly facing a spiritual crisis? One evening, as Luca stood guard, Father Alessio appeared once again, his face filled with urgency. The priest didn't even wait for a greeting. "I need your help," Father Alessio said, his voice low. "I've arranged everything. We must perform the ritual now." Luca's heart hammered in his chest. He had tried to avoid this moment, to push away the temptation to break the rules. But standing before the chamber, the burden of his curiosity, of his duty, and the pressure of Father Alessio's insistence became too much to bear. "I can't do it," Luca muttered, his voice wavering. "I've sworn an oath. I can't break the rules." Father Alessio's gaze softened, but there was an edge of desperation in his eyes. "Think about it, Luca. If we don't act now, the Vatican's power will continue to fade. We can't stand by while the Church crumbles. I believe in what we're doing, don't you?" Luca's mind raced. He was torn between his oath and the growing belief that maybe, just maybe, Father Alessio was right. What if the artifact could heal the Church? What if his duty wasn't just to guard the chamber, but to help the Vatican in its greatest time of need? The silence around them felt suffocating. The whispers from within the chamber seemed louder now, more insistent, more real. Finally, Luca spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help you, Father, but if this goes wrong, if we're punished for breaking the rules, I won't be able to live with myself." Father Alessio nodded quickly, his face lighting up with a mixture of gratitude and anticipation. "We're doing the right thing, Luca. This is the only way." Luca's heart raced as he stepped closer to the door. He had broken the cardinal rule, but he couldn't deny the nagging curiosity, the temptation to see the truth. With a final, trembling breath, he turned the key in the lock. Father Alessio's urgency reaches its peak as he finally convinces Luca to open the chamber of silence. Despite the warnings, the moral conflict, and the unspoken fear, Luca succumbs to the pressure. With trembling hands, he turns the key, breaking the sacred seal and allowing Father Alessio to step inside. The moment the door opens, a wave of ancient, unnatural energy floods the chamber, causing the air to grow thick and suffocating. Inside, they find the artifact, a strange, ancient relic wrapped in cloth, its presence both mesmerizing and foreboding. As they unearth the artifact, an overwhelming force awakens within the chamber, and Luca and Father Alessio are immediately engulfed in darkness. The entity, long sealed away, stirs, its power beginning to reach beyond the confines of the chamber, with consequences neither of them could have predicted. Luca stood at the door of the Chamber of Silence, his heart racing as the weight of the decision settled heavily in his chest. The echo of Father Alessio's voice urging him on rang in his ears. This is our only chance. Luca had never been this close. For years, the chamber had stood before him, a monument to rules, secrecy, and fear. But tonight, the air was different. The whispers from inside had become too loud to ignore. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices. With a deep breath, Luca turned the key. The sound of the ancient lock releasing was loud, reverberating through the corridor like the first crack of thunder before a storm. The door creaked open, and for the first time in his life, Luca felt the full weight of the chamber's ancient presence, as if the entire room exhaled a sigh of relief, or perhaps something far darker. Father Alessio stepped forward, his face illuminated by the dim torchlight, a look of triumph in his eyes. "We've done it, Luca. The truth is within our reach." Luca's throat was dry, his hands trembling. This wasn't right. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to close the door and walk away. But as he glanced at Father Alessio's determined face, the words he had heard earlier echoed in his mind. "The Vatican's survival depends on this." Without another word, Father Alessio crossed the threshold. Luca followed, each step feeling heavier than the last. The moment they entered, Luca felt the temperature drop. The air in the chamber was thick, almost suffocating. He could feel a strange pressure building in his chest as though the space was alive, breathing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The walls of the chamber were covered in ancient symbols, etched into the stone by hands long forgotten. The dim light from the torches flickered uneasily, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. But the real presence in the room came from the center, the artifact, wrapped carefully in a cloth, sitting on a pedestal surrounded by an ornate altar. Luca's breath caught in his throat. It was unlike anything he had imagined. The artifact wasn't just an object, it radiated a strange energy, a power that seemed to pulse through the air like static. It beckoned them, calling to something deep within their souls. For a moment, Luca thought he saw it move, shifting beneath its cloth. Father Alessio approached the pedestal, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of reverence and obsession. He reached out to the cloth, his fingers trembling as they brushed against its surface. Luca watched, frozen, as the priest slowly unveiled the artifact. The cloth fell away, revealing a dark, twisted object. Its form was hard to comprehend, almost as if it were both solid and ethereal, shifting before their eyes. The artifact seemed to absorb the light in the room, drawing it into the dark crevices of its form. For a split second, Luca could hear it, a voice, a low, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "Release me." He staggered back, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog that had suddenly filled his mind. But Father Alessio, driven by his obsession, was too far gone. "It's more magnificent than I ever imagined," Father Alessio murmured, his voice thick with awe. "This is the key, the answer to everything." As his words filled the air, something shifted in the room, something dark. The moment Father Alessio's hands fully uncovered the artifact, the room seemed to shudder. The walls groaned, as if the very structure of the chamber was coming to life. Luca felt the change instantly. The air grew heavy, oppressive, almost as though it was pressing against him, pushing him into the stone walls. Father Alessio stepped back, a look of wonder on his face as the artifact seemed to hum, vibrating with an unseen power. The air was thick with static, crackling as if a storm were brewing inside the chamber itself. But it was not just the storm that Luca felt. It was the presence, the awareness that something ancient, otherworldly, and dangerous had awoken. Suddenly, the whispers from the walls became louder, clearer. They were no longer just words. They were screams, voices pleading, crying, and laughing all at once. Luca felt his chest tighten, his heart thudding painfully as he tried to block out the cacophony of sound. His eyes widened as the darkness around them seemed to deepen, like an impenetrable fog filling the room. Then the artifact shifted, its form warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. The air turned cold, frigid, as if all the warmth had been sucked from the world. A dark shadow began to emerge from within the artifact, a shape that seemed to stretch and writhe, becoming something alive. "Let me out." The voice, deep and hollow, rumbled through the chamber. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was in their minds, filling their thoughts, pulling at their very souls. Luca staggered back, but it was too late. The darkness had already begun to engulf them. Father Alessio, his face pale with a mixture of terror and ecstasy, seemed to stand frozen. It's free." The shadow twisted and surged outward, growing stronger by the second. Luca couldn't breathe. The darkness pressed in on him, cold and suffocating, and all he could hear was that same voice calling, demanding to be released. "No, no, this is wrong," Luca managed to whisper, his voice cracking. His body trembled with the weight of the overwhelming presence that seemed to flood every inch of the chamber. The room began to spin, the walls warping around them as the entity's power took hold. The artifact, now glowing with a dark, unholy light, seemed to pulse in time with Luca's rapidly escalating heartbeat. The floor beneath their feet began to crack and shift, as though the very foundations of the Vatican were being torn apart. Luca looked at Father Alessio, his eyes wide with both awe and terror. The priest, having crossed the line and broken the seal, was no longer in control. His gaze was fixed on the artifact, his lips murmuring something Luca couldn't understand. You can't stop it." The voice within the darkness whispered again. Luca's mind began to fracture under the pressure, the overwhelming terror and confusion consuming him. He had broken the rule, he had opened the door, and now something far worse than he could have ever imagined was awakening. The shadows reached out, swirling around Father Alessio and Luca. The air was thick with the smell of decay and ancient power. Luca felt himself being drawn closer to the artifact, to the darkness that had been released. And then, everything went black. As Luca and Father Alessio stand before the awakened entity, they are each confronted by its tempting offers, unimaginable power, divine knowledge, and eternal life, but at the cost of their souls. Luca, though deeply tempted by the entity's promises, resists, remembering his duty to the Vatican and the oath he swore to protect the Chamber of Silence. He fights against the growing pressure to give in to the entity's whispers. On the other hand, Father Alessio, driven by his obsession with the artifact, begins to succumb to the temptation, his resolve crumbling as he is drawn further into the entity's promises of truth and immortality. As the entity grows stronger, the battle between good and evil, duty and temptation, intensifies, and both men are forced to face the consequences of their choices. The chamber had descended into total darkness, the only light coming from the artifact, which now glowed with an otherworldly, pulsating light that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The air was thick with the oppressive presence of the entity, its essence pressing in on Luca and Father Alessio, both men caught in its psychological grasp. As they stood before the artifact, the air seemed to shift, growing heavier as if it were alive, watching them, waiting. Luca could feel it, a growing tension in the very fabric of reality. The entity's voice echoed inside his mind, a soft whisper at first, but growing louder with every passing second. I know your heart, Luca Bellini. I know your doubt, your fear. You were never meant to guard this secret. You were meant to be free. The power you seek is within your reach if only you let go. Luca's skin prickled as the voice slithered through his mind. The temptation to give in was overwhelming, a force so powerful it seemed to invade every thought he had. The promise of freedom, of power, of answers to the questions that had consumed him for so long was so close. His fingers twitched, aching to reach out to the artifact. But then Luca remembered his duty. His mind flashed to the faces of those he had sworn to protect, to the solemn responsibility that had defined his life for years. His father's words echoed in his mind. Duty above all else, Luca. Duty to the church. Duty to God. I will not succumb, Luca whispered under his breath, his voice trembling with the effort. He closed his eyes tightly, forcing himself to block out the entity's voice. But the entity, sensing his resistance, changed tactics. You think your duty is everything, Luca. Your duty has bound you to a prison, the prison of ignorance. You could have the truth, Luca. You could see the world for what it really is. You could have all the knowledge the Vatican keeps from you. But to have it, you must sacrifice your soul for the truth. What will you choose, the knowledge of the universe or eternal blindness? Luca's body shook with the intensity of the temptation. What if it was true? What if the Vatican had been hiding the truth all along? The whispers, the eerie presence of the chamber, the power of the artifact, it all called to him, promising liberation from his doubts, freedom from the shackles of obedience. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought about giving in. What was one's soul? What was his soul compared to the truth? What was the cost of knowing everything? But then, just as the thought began to take root, Luca felt a shift, a small flicker of light deep within himself. He remembered his oath, the sacred trust the Vatican had placed in him. His soul, his faith, could not be bought by the promises of an ancient, malevolent force. He took a deep breath, his hands tightening around the halberd at his side, grounding himself. He would not give in. The entity's promises were nothing but lies, lies designed to break him. As Luca resisted the entity's call, Father Alessio stood motionless beside him, his face pale, his eyes locked on the artifact. The younger priest's resolve, which had once seemed so strong, had begun to crack. The temptation was too much, too overwhelming. "You don't understand, Luca," Father Alessio muttered, his voice distant. This is what I've been searching for my entire life. I've spent so long in the shadows seeking the truth, and now it's right here, the knowledge of the ages. I can't ignore it anymore. I can't let it go." Luca turned to face Father Alessio, his heart sinking. He could see it now, Father Alessio's eyes wide and glazed with an unnatural hunger. The priest was no longer in control. The entity had already begun to consume him, twisting his desire for knowledge into something darker, more dangerous. "Father, no," Luca said, his voice pleading. "You don't understand. This isn't the truth. It's a trap. The power it offers is a lie. There's a price. A terrible price." Father Alessio didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, drawn to the artifact with an almost magnetic pull. His hand trembled as he reached out, fingers brushing against the cold, dark surface of the relic. "It's not a lie, Luca. It's the answer to everything. We were meant to find it. I was meant to have it." As Alessio touched the artifact, the chamber seemed to shake with an explosion of energy, the power of the artifact surging outward. A dark wind, like the breath of an ancient beast, filled the room. Luca stumbled back, his head spinning as the shadows in the room seemed to grow, enveloping them both. Father Alessio's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and for a brief moment Luca saw something terrifying. The priest's soul had already begun to fade. His body was still there, but the light of life in his eyes had been replaced by something otherworldly. The entity's voice filled the chamber again, this time directed solely at Father Alessio. "You understand now, Father Alessio. You see the truth. You have chosen. Now you will be mine forever." Luca's heart clenched as he watched Father Alessio fall deeper into the entity's grasp. He had lost him. The priest, once a man of faith, had given in to the promise of power and eternal knowledge. Luca stood motionless, his heart pounding as the darkness closed in. The temptation still called to him, but this time Luca knew what he had to do. The truth was not in the artifact. It wasn't in the lies that the entity whispered. He had sworn to protect the Vatican, to protect the sacred secrets of the chamber. He would not let this entity, this evil force, consume him just as it had consumed Father Alessio. Luca stepped forward, his resolve hardening like steel. He would resist, no matter the cost. The truth was not worth sacrificing his soul. "I will not fall," Luca whispered to himself, taking one final step toward Father Alessio. He reached out and gripped Father Alessio's arm, pulling him away from the artifact, pulling him back from the darkness that had taken hold of him. But the entity was not done. "You think you can resist me, Luca? Think again." The darkness shifted, and for a moment the room was filled with an overwhelming light, a light so bright it felt like it was burning through the very fabric of reality. Luca held on tightly to Father Alessio, his hands shaking with the weight of his choice. The entity had offered them everything: power, knowledge, eternal life. But Luca knew one thing for certain now. No power was worth the price of their souls. In the aftermath of breaking the sacred seal, Luca tries to escape the chamber of silence. desperate to undo the catastrophe he and Father Alessio have caused. But as he moves through the chamber, he finds Father Alessio in a trance, performing a dark ritual that seems to channel the entity's power. The very walls of the chamber begin to shake as the artifact's power surges uncontrollably, causing the Vatican to tremble. The entity, now fully awakened, begins to tear its way into the world, its influence spreading beyond the chamber. Luca realizes the gravity of his actions. Breaking the rules has released something far worse than he could ever have imagined, and now there may be no way to stop it. As the Vatican collapses, Luca must face the consequences of his disobedience, and the consequences are far more terrifying than he ever imagined. Luca stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as he felt the shift in the air. The darkness was no longer just in the chamber, it was everywhere. The walls around him groaned and creaked, as though the very stones themselves were alive, suffocating under the weight of the entity's power. The artifact pulsed with an unnatural light, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble in sync with its power. Luca's mind raced. He had broken the rules. The Vatican had trusted him to keep the secrets of the chamber, and he had failed. The entity, this ancient force, was now fully awakened, and its power was no longer contained. He could feel it deep in his bones, a presence that threatened not only the Vatican but the world itself. As the walls shook violently, Luca turned toward Father Alessio, his pulse quickening. The priest stood before the altar, his face expressionless, his eyes glazed over. He was chanting, muttering words that seemed to come from a language Luca could not comprehend. His hands moved in strange, deliberate gestures, each one more disturbing than the last. "Father, stop!" Luca shouted, rushing toward him. "What are you doing?" But Father Alessio didn't respond. His voice was low but filled with a dark fervor as he continued his ritual. The truth must be revealed. We must bring it forth. We must open the door completely." Father Alessio whispered, his voice carrying a strange resonance, as if the entity itself were speaking through him. Luca's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. Father Alessio had succumbed completely. The temptation had taken him, and now he was summoning the very force that had been locked away for centuries. "No, you don't understand, Father," Luca cried, his voice breaking. He reached out and grabbed the priest by the shoulders, trying to shake him back to reality. But Father Alessio was lost, his body stiff, his movements mechanical as he continued to chant. Suddenly, there was a deafening roar. The chamber itself seemed to scream, its walls cracking and splintering under the force of the entity's release. The air grew thick with energy, crackling with an unnatural hum. The shadows in the chamber began to twist, stretching and crawling across the stone like living things. Luca staggered back, eyes wide with fear, as the ground beneath him cracked open. The chamber was collapsing. The ancient, sacred space that had been a cornerstone of Vatican secrecy for centuries was crumbling in an instant. But it wasn't just the physical walls that were breaking. The very fabric of reality itself seemed to tear apart. As the chaos intensified, Luca saw it, a dark storm, a swirling mass of shadows and unnatural light forming in the center of the chamber. It was the entity, a formless, terrifying presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The artifact glowed with a malevolent light, pulsating in time with the dark energy that surrounded it. The entity was free, and it was angry. Luca could feel its presence pressing in on him, its mind reaching into his thoughts, filling his head with horrific images and voices that were not his own. It was calling to him, trying to bend his will, but Luca resisted with everything he had. "You should have stayed away, Luca," the entity's voice whispered inside his head. "Now you have released me. There is no escape from what you have done." The walls of the Vatican began to shake. The very foundation of the holy city trembled under the weight of the entity's awakening. The temples, the chapels, the sacred spaces were now filled with the darkness the entity had unleashed. The Vatican, the seat of Catholic power, was crumbling, its walls torn apart by an ancient force it had once hidden from the world. Father Alessio stood in the center of the chaos, his eyes vacant, as though the entity had claimed him completely. The air around him was charged, the energy so thick that it felt as though it was crushing Luca's chest. "Father, please," Luca shouted, but there was no response. Alessio's hands were raised to the air as if in prayer, his voice rising in a chant that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "Let it in, let it take us all." The entity's voice echoed once more, deep and crushing. "The time has come. The world shall know what lies behind the veil. The truth is no longer hidden. The power of creation and destruction is now mine to wield. And it shall be yours, Father Alessio, if you give yourself to me fully. And you, Luca Bellini, you will regret ever standing in my way." The ground beneath Luca's feet began to collapse, the stone crumbling and the walls buckling in on themselves. The entity's power was consuming everything around him, and he knew that if he stayed any longer, he would be swallowed up by the darkness. He had to get out. Luca turned, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled, his body feeling heavy, almost as though it was being pulled back toward the artifact. The temptation was there, stronger than ever, but he fought it. His duty, his oath, his soul, he couldn't abandon them now. Luca sprinted toward the exit, the screams of Father Alessio and the roars of the collapsing chamber ringing in his ears. The darkness was closing in behind him, but Luca pushed forward, using every ounce of his strength to break free. As he ran down the corridor, the walls cracked and splintered, and the very earth beneath the Vatican shook. The entity was no longer contained. It had been unleashed, and now the world would feel its wrath. Luca didn't look back. The only thing he could do was survive and warn the Vatican of the consequences of breaking the sacred rules. With the Vatican under siege by the powerful entity, Luca realizes that the only hope for survival is to rally the Swiss guards, priests, and anyone he can find to protect the sacred heart of the Church. The entity's power has already breached the chamber, and its dark influence begins to spread throughout the Vatican, threatening to tear the entire structure, and everything the Church represents, apart. As Luca leads the charge, they fight fiercely to keep the entity from reaching the surface, but the creature is more powerful than they ever imagined. The stakes are higher than ever as the forces of good, represented by the guards and the faithful, battle against the overwhelming, oppressive evil that has been unleashed. The battle is not just physical, but also spiritual, as the clash of light vs. dark takes on a deeper meaning. The Vatican, once a place of sacred peace, now trembled under the weight of an ancient evil that threatened to unravel everything. The air was thick with tension, and Luca could feel the darkness closing in, a shadow that stretched its fingers into every corner of the holy city. The entity had broken free, its power pouring through the cracks in the earth, consuming everything in its path. Luca sprinted through the stone corridors of the Vatican, his heart pounding, as the rumblings of the earthquake-like tremors reverberated around him. The walls shook, the very foundation of the sacred buildings crumbling beneath the weight of the entity's influence. The whispers had turned into screams, filling the air with voices that clawed at his sanity. He could hear the chaos outside, cries for help, the clatter of weapons, the desperate shouts of the Swiss guards. They were fighting to hold the line. But Luca knew the truth. This was not a fight they could win alone. The entity was not just a creature. It was an ancient force, something immense, something that existed before the Vatican itself. They could try to fight it, try to keep it contained, but in the end, the creature's power was too much. As Luca rounded the corner, he saw a familiar face, Commander Reyes, his mentor, standing tall despite the chaos surrounding them. "Luca," Reyes barked. "The Swiss guards are holding the gates, but we can't keep this up for much longer. We need to get to the heart of this, the source of the power." Luca nodded, his resolve firm. He could feel the burning sensation in his chest, a mix of fear and determination. "We can't let it reach the surface," Luca said. "We can't let it spread beyond the Vatican. If the entity reaches the surface, it will consume the world," Reyes finished grimly. "I know. We need a plan, fast." With no time to lose, Luca and Reyes moved quickly through the halls, calling on the Swiss guards and priests to assemble. Luca had worked alongside these men for years, but today he could see something different in their eyes. Fear, yes, but also resolve. They knew the Vatican's fate was in their hands. "Form a perimeter, men," Luca shouted to the guards. "We hold the gates at all costs. Do not let the entity breach the surface. Do not let it touch the people." The guards saluted, their eyes steely with determination as they prepared for the battle ahead. But Luca knew the battle was not just physical. The entity had already begun to corrupt the minds of those who were closest to it. The whispers were growing louder, and the temptation to surrender to the dark power was everywhere. He couldn't let that happen, not on his watch. "Priests," Luca called, his voice carrying through the corridors. "We need your strength, your faith. You must hold the sanctuaries. Pray for light to push back the darkness. Use every holy relic, every prayer. We need the Church's power to fight this evil." The priests, their faces set with purpose, immediately began to gather sacred relics, holy water, crucifixes, and other sacred symbols to strengthen their position. The ground continued to tremble beneath them, the entity's influence growing stronger with every passing second. Luca could hear the screams from the outside, the sounds of men fighting for their lives against the darkness that had taken root. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and fire, and the flickering of torches cast long shadows that seemed to dance and twist, almost as if alive. Then, suddenly, the walls exploded. A huge surge of dark energy poured through the Vatican's sacred gates, flooding the halls like a tsunami of malevolent force. Luca barely had time to react before a wave of darkness engulfed the room. "Hold fast," Reyes shouted as he and Luca took their positions at the front of the line. The guards raised their weapons, but they were no match for the entity's power. The entity was no longer confined to the chamber. It was everywhere, its tendrils of shadow reaching out to consume everything it touched. Luca could feel the weight of its presence pushing down on them, psychological warfare at its most potent. The whispers were everywhere in his mind, trying to break him, to turn him. "Give in," it whispered. "Let me take you, let me show you the truth." But Luca fought back. He focused on the here and now, on the vow he had sworn to protect the Vatican, to defend the Church against all threats. This was his fight. For the Vatican, he shouted as he charged into the fray, leading the guards forward. The stakes were higher than ever. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the soul of the church itself. But the entity was too strong. It surged forward, its dark tendrils wrapping around everything. The guards were being pushed back, their weapons ineffective against the unseen force that had taken hold of the Vatican. Father Alessio, now fully consumed by the entity, stood at the heart of the battle. His once clear eyes were empty, his face a mask of madness as he raised his hands toward the ceiling, chanting in a language that felt like an ancient curse. Luca saw the danger. Father Alessio was the key. The entity was using him as a conduit for its power, and if they didn't stop him, the whole Vatican would fall. "We have to stop him," Luca shouted to Reyes. "He's the anchor. If we can break the connection, we can stop it from spreading further." Luca and Reyes fought their way toward the priest, dodging falling debris and battling against the psychic assault the entity had launched. It felt like the very ground was turning against them, shifting and crumbling under the pressure of the battle. Finally, Luca reached Father Alessio, his heart pounding as he saw the priest's eyes glowing with the dark power of the entity. "Father," Luca called, grabbing him by the shoulders. "This isn't you, this isn't what you wanted. Come back to us." But Father Alessio didn't respond. He was beyond saving. The entity had fully consumed him, and now it was using him to tear apart the Vatican. In one last, desperate act, Luca drew his weapon and struck Father Alessio's arm, hoping to sever the connection. But the entity fought back, sending a wave of dark energy through the air. Luca was thrown backward, crashing into the stone wall. As the room spun around him, Luca knew they were losing. The Vatican was under siege, and they were outmatched. The battle between good and evil was raging. But the darkness was growing too strong. Luca stands alone in the heart of the Chamber of Silence, facing the full force of the entity he has helped unleash. The Vatican is on the brink of destruction, and the entity's power has grown beyond comprehension. With no other options left, Luca taps into the ancient rituals he learned during his time guarding the chamber. He realizes that in order to save the Vatican and banish the entity back to the abyss, he must sacrifice himself. As the final showdown unfolds, Luca fights against the overwhelming darkness, knowing that in doing so, he will seal the chamber forever, but at the cost of his own soul. His heroic act will save the world, but it will also condemn him to an eternity bound to the chamber. Luca's soul is now the eternal guardian, ensuring that the entity will never again escape, but he can never leave the darkness himself. The Chamber of Silence trembled beneath Luca's feet as the full force of the entity loomed before him. The walls groaned and cracked, the sacred space falling apart under the weight of the power that had been unleashed. The air was thick with darkness, the shadows now living things, writhing and twisting around Luca like serpents. His body was sore, battered from the battle, but his resolve was unwavering. He had come this far, and he could not let the Vatican, the Church, or the world fall into the hands of the entity. In front of him stood the artifact, now fully revealed in all its dark glory, its power surging uncontrollably. The entity's form was formless, a mass of swirling shadows and unnatural light, but its presence filled every corner of the chamber, pressing in on Luca like a suffocating weight. He could feel it deep in his soul. The entity knew him, it understood his fears, his desires, and was using them against him. "Luca Bellini," the entity's voice boomed, its tone dripping with malice. "You cannot stop me. You are nothing but a mortal. You are too weak to stand against my power. You have already failed. Your world is mine." Luca stood tall, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He could feel the curse of his sacrifice closing in on him, but he refused to falter. He had a duty. He had sworn an oath. "I am not afraid of you, entity." Luca's voice was steady, his grip tightening on the ritual tome he had discovered in the chamber's depths. "You may have power, but I have something you cannot understand, duty ***. The church, this world, my soul will protect them. ***. The entity howled in rage, the very fabric of the chamber shaking as though the world was coming undone. "You think your duty will save you. You cannot win. I will consume you just as I have consumed all who came before you." Luca raised the ritual tome, his hand steady despite the swirling storm of darkness around him. He knew what he had to do. He had studied the rituals for years, and now it was time to use everything he had learned. The ritual could banish the entity, but it would come at an unimaginable cost, one Luca had already accepted. "This ends now." He began chanting the ancient words inscribed in the ritual book, his voice unwavering as the language of the past filled the air. The shadows recoiled as if in fear, and the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with an energy that was both terrifying and sacred. The more Luca spoke, the more the entity shrieked, a sound so inhuman, so raw, that it threatened to tear Luca's sanity apart. But he held on, his focus unbroken. As Luca continued to chant, the darkness around him seemed to pull back, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as if the ritual was finally taking hold. The artifact began to glow, its unnatural light flashing in sync with Luca's incantation. The entity screamed in fury, its form swirling violently, trying to break free from the barrier Luca was constructing, but Luca would not allow it to escape. The ritual's final words came with a great force, and as Luca uttered them, a blinding light exploded from the artifact, engulfing the room. The entity screamed one last time, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke, but its voice lingered in Luca's mind, whispering dark promises of destruction, of eternal suffering. But it was over. The entity was sealed, its power contained once again. The door to the chamber was closing, but Luca knew that the ritual would come at a terrible cost. As the light dimmed, Luca collapsed to his knees, his strength gone. His chest heaved as he looked at the sealed door. The Vatican had been saved, the world was safe for now. But Luca knew that he had sealed his own fate. Luca could feel the entity's grip on him, not physically, but in his very soul. His body felt numb, as if the darkness was creeping into him, weaving itself into the very essence of who he was. His soul, now bound to the chamber, would forever serve as the guardian of the entity's prison. He had sacrificed himself. He had given up his freedom for the greater good, for the Vatican, for the world. But as he stood there, his body shaking and his mind clouded, he knew that this was the cost of his decision. His soul was no longer his own. I am bound," Luca whispered, his voice cracking. His eyes closed, the weight of his fate settling heavily on his shoulders. The chamber was now quiet, the darkness gone, but in its place there was silence, an oppressive silence, one that would never fade. Luca could no longer leave the chamber. He was its eternal guardian, cursed to stand watch over the artifact for as long as the chamber remained intact. He had fulfilled his duty, but at the price of his freedom. With the entity sealed and the Vatican saved from certain destruction, the world outside begins to heal from the devastation caused by the entity's awakening. However, Luca's sacrifice has come at a steep price. His name is now immortalized in the lore of the Vatican, remembered as the guard who protected the world from the ancient entity. Future Swiss guards whisper his name, honoring his selflessness and courage. Yet, while his legacy lives on, Luca's soul remains trapped within the chamber, bound by the very ritual that saved the church. He is eternally bound to the chamber, his sacrifice now part of the Vatican's sacred history. Luca's name will be passed down through generations, but his suffering endures in the silence of the chamber. This part reflects on the martyrdom and eternal duty that are core to Catholic teachings. How sacrifice for the greater good often requires a price that transcends life itself. In the days that followed the battle for the Vatican, the world began to rebuild. The Vatican's structures, sacred temples, libraries, and chapels, slowly returned to their former glory. The streets were filled with people once again, walking under the shadows of ancient columns, unaware of the darkness that had almost consumed their world. The Vatican's power and influence had been restored, and the faithful once again turned to the Church for guidance. But amidst the rebuilding, the Vatican's leaders could not ignore the price they had paid. The entity had been contained, but it had come at the expense of one of their own, Luca Bellini, the Swiss guard who had sacrificed his soul to protect the church. A memorial was erected in honor of Luca in the hall of the Swiss guard, a simple plaque carved with his name, his rank, and his final act of bravery. The plaque read, "Luca Bellini, guardian of the Vatican, defender of the light. His sacrifice saved the world." But the truth was more complex than the plaque could capture. Luca had not only saved the Vatican, he had saved humanity from an ancient evil, one that had sought to tear the very fabric of the world apart. His bravery and selflessness became a tale told for generations, passed down from guard to guard, priest to priest. But Luca's real sacrifice, his eternal duty, his endless torment, remained a closely guarded secret, known only to those who understood the true cost of the chamber's protection. Years passed, and with each passing generation, new guards took their positions, standing before the chamber of silence. And with each new guard, Luca's name was whispered. It became part of the ritual, a quiet remembrance, a warning to those who would stand where he once stood. Every time a new recruit entered the service, they were told the story of Luca Bellini, the young Swiss guard who had given everything for the Vatican. They were told that the chamber was sacred, that no one could look inside, no one could break the rules. And they were told of Luca's courage, how he had resisted the darkness, how his sacrifice had bound him to the chamber forever. The guards, standing silent at their posts, would feel Luca's presence, even though he was no longer among them. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the whispers from the chamber grew louder, they would hear the faintest echo of his name. It was a warning. It was a reminder of the price of disobedience. In the deepest recesses of the Vatican, where the Chamber of Silence stood, Luca's soul remained trapped, eternally bound to the place he had sworn to protect. Though the entity was gone, his sacrifice could never be undone. His duty had bound him to the chamber, and he would never leave. In the quiet of the night, when the Vatican was still, Luca's presence could still be felt in the chamber of silence. The torches that flickered in the hallway would cast long shadows, stretching out toward the sealed door of the chamber where Luca had sacrificed everything. His soul lingered, bound by the very ritual that had sealed the entity away. He was forever a guardian, but never again free. Luca Bellini, the Swiss guard, would whisper to each other as they took their positions. "He is with us, guarding the secrets. He is the one who protected us." Luca could never leave the chamber. His soul was now part of its eternal duty, a sacrifice made to protect the Vatican and the world from the horrors hidden within its walls. He was the last defense, the unsung hero whose name was spoken with reverence and sorrow by those who came after him. And so, Luca's legacy was immortalized, not in statues or monuments, but in the lives of the men who followed his path. They stood before the chamber, knowing the price of their duty, and they whispered his name as they took their posts, knowing that they too were part of the sacrifice that had saved the world. Generations after Luca Bellini's tragic sacrifice, a new Swiss guard named Marco takes up the same post that Luca once held. Marco, young and eager to prove himself, finds himself standing at the same door, guarding the same chamber that Luca had protected with his life. As time passes, Marco begins to hear the faint, haunting whispers of Luca's soul. These whispers carry warnings of the dangers that still lie within the chamber and the burden of the sacred duty he has inherited. Marco, like the guards before him, begins to understand the weight of his role. He is not only protecting the chamber, but also standing in the footsteps of a martyr, whose sacrifice is now an eternal part of the Vatican's history. As the whispers grow louder, Marco realizes that Luca's legacy is more than just a story. It's a continuing struggle, an endless cycle of vigilance that binds each new guard to the same sacred duty. The legacy of Luca Bellini lives on, haunting the halls of the Vatican, a reminder that the fight against the darkness is never-ending. Marco stood before the chamber of silence, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. Today was the day he had waited for, his first post as a Swiss guard at the Vatican. He had heard the stories, of course. Every guard knew the legend of Luca Bellini, the man who had sacrificed his soul to save the Vatican from an ancient evil. But Marco had never truly understood the weight of it, until now. The chamber loomed before him, its ancient door covered in dark symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Marco had been trained in the strictest traditions, taught the rules that had been passed down from one generation of guards to the next. No one enters, no one looks inside, and no one speaks of what lies within. He had memorized every detail of the ritual, every warning, but today, the gravity of his position hit him in a way it never had before. He took his place before the door, just as the guards before him had done. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of sacred duty, and Marco felt the loneliness of the position. He was now part of something larger than himself. He was part of the vigilance that had protected the Vatican for generations. But as he stood there, something began to stir in the air. The whispers, soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, began to rise, filling the empty space around him. Marco furrowed his brow. He hadn't heard the whispers during his training. This was new. Luca Bellini, Luca Bellini. The name was barely a whisper, but it echoed in his mind, sending a chill down his spine. Marco shook his head, trying to focus, but the whispers grew louder. "You are not alone here. I am always with you, always, guarding the chamber. The price of this duty is eternal." Marco clenched his fists, trying to block out the voices. He wasn't the first to stand here, he knew that. Guards had come and gone, and each had faced the same duty, the same sacrifice. But hearing Luca's name, hearing those whispers, it was like the past had come alive, pressing in on him, reminding him that he was not just standing guard. He was now part of something greater, something eternal. Days passed, and Marco settled into his role. He followed the rules as any good Swiss guard would. He stood at his post day after day, but the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent. The chamber is not safe. It was never meant to be sealed away. There is more within, more than they know. At first, Marco thought he was imagining it. Maybe it was the isolation, the long hours of standing watch. But the whispers were too clear, too constant. Luca's voice seemed to fill the air around him, guiding him, warning him. Luca Bellini, Luca Bellini. One night, as the moonlight filtered through the high windows of the Vatican, Marco could feel the presence of the whispers more strongly than ever. They weren't just in his mind anymore. They were all around him, echoing off the walls of the chamber. "Who's there?" Marco called out, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. He had always believed the stories, but now he felt like he was part of them. Was this a ritual? Was this Luca's spirit still bound to the chamber? "You must not break the rules," the voice whispered again, more urgently this time. "The price is too high. You must guard the secrets as I did. The darkness never sleeps." Marco's knees felt weak, his head spinning. The weight of the duty that had been passed down through generations of guards was crushing. The whispers were no longer just a reminder. They were a warning, an echo of what had come before him. Luca's soul was bound to the chamber, and now, it seemed, so was his. As the days wore on, Marco began to understand the weight of his duty. The whispers were not just memories. They were Luca's legacy. Luca's sacrifice had ensured that the chamber remained sealed, that the entity would never escape. But it had come at a price. Luca's soul was now bound to the very chamber he had protected. "I have given everything for this," the voice whispered, "and so will you." Marco's heart clenched as the weight of that truth settled in. The sacrifice was not just an act of bravery, it was eternal. The vigilance of the Swiss guard was a never-ending cycle. They stood watch not just for the church, but for something greater than themselves. And in doing so, they were bound to the very place they guarded. Marco began to hear the stories differently now. The guards who had stood before him, who had whispered Luca's name in reverence, they knew. They knew that the price of protecting the Vatican was more than just physical. It was a soulful sacrifice, one that would echo through the centuries. Years passed, and Marco became part of the lore of the Vatican. His name, too, was whispered by future guards, as he had whispered Luca's. The torch was passed, and the duty was carried on, but the legacy of Luca Bellini never faded. Each new generation of Swiss guards would stand at the chamber's door, feeling the weight of their duty, hearing the whispers, and knowing that they were guardians of something far larger than themselves. Marco's name would be passed down as the one who stood after Luca Bellini, and in that same tradition, the names of all who came after him would be spoken with the same reverence. And so, the eternal cycle continued, one generation of guards after the other, standing vigilant before the chamber of silence, knowing that the darkness they faced was eternal and that their duty would never end. Luca Bellini, they whispered, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. The guardian who protected the world, the guardian who never left. Generations after Luca Bellini's tragic sacrifice, a new Swiss guard named Marco takes up the same post that Luca once held. Marco, young and eager to prove himself, finds himself standing at the same door, guarding the same chamber that Luca had protected with his life. As time passes, Marco begins to hear the faint, haunting whispers of Luca's soul. These whispers carry warnings of the dangers that still lie within the chamber and the burden of the sacred duty he has inherited. Marco, like the guards before him, begins to understand the weight of his role. He is not only protecting the chamber, but also standing in the footsteps of a martyr, whose sacrifice is now an eternal part of the Vatican's history. As the whispers grow louder, Marco realizes that Luca's legacy is more than just a story. It's a continuing struggle, an endless cycle of vigilance that binds each new guard to the same sacred duty. The legacy of Luca Bellini lives on, haunting the halls of the Vatican, a reminder that the fight against the darkness is never-ending. Marco stood before the chamber of silence, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. Today was the day he had waited for, his first post as a Swiss guard at the Vatican. He had heard the stories, of course. Every guard knew the legend of Luca Bellini, the man who had sacrificed his soul to save the Vatican from an ancient evil. But Marco had never truly understood the weight of it, until now. The chamber loomed before him, its ancient door covered in dark symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Marco had been trained in the strictest traditions, taught the rules that had been passed down from one generation of guards to the next. No one enters, no one looks inside, and no one speaks of what lies within. He had memorized every detail of the ritual, every warning, but today, the gravity of his position hit him in a way it never had before. He took his place before the door, just as the guards before him had done. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of sacred duty, and Marco felt the loneliness of the position. He was now part of something larger than himself. He was part of the vigilance that had protected the Vatican for generations. But as he stood there, something began to stir in the air. The whispers, soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, began to rise, filling the empty space around him. Marco furrowed his brow. He hadn't heard the whispers during his training. This was new. Luca Bellini, Luca Bellini. The name was barely a whisper, but it echoed in his mind, sending a chill down his spine. Marco shook his head, trying to focus, but the whispers grew louder. "You are not alone here. I am always with you, always, guarding the chamber. The price of this duty is eternal." Marco clenched his fists, trying to block out the voices. He wasn't the first to stand here, he knew that. Guards had come and gone, and each had faced the same duty, the same sacrifice. But hearing Luca's name, hearing those whispers, it was like the past had come alive, pressing in on him, reminding him that he was not just standing guard. He was now part of something greater, something eternal. Days passed, and Marco settled into his role. He followed the rules as any good Swiss guard would. He stood at his post day after day, but the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent. The chamber is not safe. It was never meant to be sealed away. There is more within, more than they know. At first, Marco thought he was imagining it. Maybe it was the isolation, the long hours of standing watch. But the whispers were too clear, too constant. Luca's voice seemed to fill the air around him, guiding him, warning him. Luca Bellini, Luca Bellini. One night, as the moonlight filtered through the high windows of the Vatican, Marco could feel the presence of the whispers more strongly than ever. They weren't just in his mind anymore. They were all around him, echoing off the walls of the chamber. "Who's there?" Marco called out, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. He had always believed the stories, but now he felt like he was part of them. Was this a ritual? Was this Luca's spirit still bound to the chamber? "You must not break the rules," the voice whispered again, more urgently this time. "The price is too high. You must guard the secrets as I did. The darkness never sleeps." Marco's knees felt weak, his head spinning. The weight of the duty that had been passed down through generations of guards was crushing. The whispers were no longer just a reminder, they were a warning, an echo of what had come before him. Luca's soul was bound to the chamber, and now, it seemed, so was his. As the days wore on, Marco began to understand the weight of his duty. The whispers were not just memories, they were Luca's legacy. Luca's sacrifice had ensured that the chamber remained sealed, that the entity would never escape, but it had come at a price. Luca's soul was now bound to the very chamber he had protected. "I have given everything for this," the voice whispered, "and so will you." Marco's heart clenched as the weight of that truth settled in. The sacrifice was not just an act of bravery, it was eternal. The vigilance of the Swiss guard was a never-ending cycle. They stood watch not just for the church, but for something greater than themselves. And in doing so, they were bound to the very place they guarded. Marco began to hear the stories differently now. The guards who had stood before him, who had whispered Luca's name in reverence, they knew. They knew that the price of protecting the Vatican was more than just physical. It was a soulful sacrifice, one that would echo through the centuries. Years passed, and Marco became part of the lore of the Vatican. His name, too, was whispered by future guards, as he had whispered Luca's. The torch was passed, and the duty was carried on, but the legacy of Luca Bellini never faded. Each new generation of Swiss guards would stand at the chamber's door, feeling the weight of their duty, hearing the whispers, and knowing that they were guardians of something far larger than themselves. Marco's name would be passed down as the one who stood after Luca Bellini, and in that same tradition, the names of all who came after him would be spoken with the same reverence. And so, the eternal cycle continued, one generation of guards after the other, standing vigilant before the chamber of silence, knowing that the darkness they faced was eternal and that their duty would never end. Luca Bellini, they whispered, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. The guardian who protected the world, the guardian who never left. As Marco grows deeper into his duties as a Swiss guard, he stumbles upon an old, forgotten prophecy hidden within the Vatican's extensive archives. The prophecy, written in cryptic language and buried in forgotten manuscripts, hints that the entity which was once sealed within the chamber of silence will one day return, stronger than before. It speaks of a time when the darkness will rise once again, threatening the Vatican and the world, and only a new generation of guards will be able to protect the Church from its power. Marco realizes that the battle against the entity is not over, it is only delayed, and his duty to guard the chamber is more critical than ever. The Vatican's fate now lies in the hands of the next generation of Swiss guards, and Marco's discovery of the prophecy reveals that the true struggle is just beginning. Marco had always been a devoted guard, but something inside him had begun to stir. The whispers of Luca Bellini still haunted his thoughts, and as much as he tried to focus on his duties, the shadow of the past loomed ever closer. He had been stationed in the Vatican for several years now, guarding the Chamber of Silence just as Luca had done before him. The whispers had become a constant presence, but over time they no longer unnerved him. Instead, they became a reminder of the sacrifice, the duty, and the darkness that had once been sealed away. But one afternoon, as Marco combed through the archives, a dusty labyrinth of centuries-old texts, manuscripts, and relics, he came across a set of ancient scrolls, hidden deep in a forgotten corner of the library. The scrolls were encased in leather, their edges brittle and yellowed with age. Faint ink traced cryptic symbols and worn, half-legible words. It was clear that no one had touched these scrolls in decades, perhaps even centuries. As Marco carefully unraveled one of the scrolls, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The language was ancient, almost unintelligible, but there was a feeling behind it, an aura of danger that Marco couldn't shake. His heart raced as he began to decipher the words. When the moon darkens thrice and the sun sets in a blood-red glow, the door shall tremble once more. The prison shall open and the beast shall rise. A new generation of watchers will stand, but only the purest shall guard the truth. The prophecy shall unfold, and the world will tremble before the ancient darkness, stronger than ever before. Marco's breath caught in his throat. The prophecy spoke of the entity, the same entity that Luca had sacrificed himself to imprison. It was clear now. The entity would return stronger than before, and this time the battle would be even more intense. The chamber of silence, which had been so carefully sealed, was merely a temporary measure, and the battle was far from over. He read further, the words becoming clearer with each line. The souls who guard will be tested. The power of the artifact will call, and the walls will tremble under the weight of the curse. The darkness will rise, and only the light of those who stand before the chamber can keep it at bay. Marco's mind spun. The entity was coming back. The walls of the Vatican would shake again. The guardians, the Swiss guards, were fated to face the darkness once more, and Marco would be at the center of it all. As Marco pondered the words of the prophecy, his mind raced. Had the Church known about this? Were the cardinals aware of the danger that loomed on the horizon? The Vatican had always hidden its secrets, but this was different. This was something far more dire, something that threatened not just the Vatican, but the entire world. He knew he had to bring this to the attention of the Vatican's higher-ups, but he hesitated. How would they react to this ancient prophecy? Would they believe him? Or would they dismiss it as just another myth buried in the dust of time? But Marco could not ignore what he had discovered. The darkness was coming, and he could feel its presence already beginning to stir. The prophecy had been written for a reason. The entity's return was inevitable, and it would be up to the next generation of Swiss guards to face it. Days passed, and Marco kept the prophecy to himself, but it weighed heavily on his mind. Every night as he stood guard before the chamber of silence, the whispers grew more intense. He could feel them tugging at the edges of his consciousness, calling to him. "The time is near, Marco. You will face what I could not." It was Luca's voice again, the same haunting voice that had spoken to him all those years ago. It echoed through his mind, louder now than ever before, as if Luca's soul was trying to prepare him for the task ahead. Marco looked toward the chamber's door, its dark surface gleaming under the flickering torchlight. The air was thick with the same oppressive energy that had once consumed Luca. The entity was coming, and Marco could feel it in his bones. He wasn't ready, but he knew that he had no choice. The Vatican's fate, the fate of the world, was now in his hands. The prophecy was clear. The darkness would rise again, and the guardians would have to stand ready to face it. One night, as Marco stood at his post, he heard the whispers again, but this time they were different. They were no longer just a warning. They were a call to action. "It is time," the voice whispered. "You know what must be done. The chamber is no longer safe. You must prepare." Marco's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the door, now feeling the weight of his duty more than ever before. The prophecy had not just been a warning. It was an invitation to a battle that would determine the fate of the Vatican and the world. As Marco steps into his first night watch at the Chamber of Silence, he feels the weight of his new position, the legacy of Luca Bellini pressing down on him. He has spent years hearing the stories and whispers of Luca's selfless sacrifice. But now, standing before the very door Luca once guarded, he faces the reality of what it means to hold this sacred responsibility. Marco is fully aware of the risks, the darkness that lurks within, the entity that once threatened the Vatican, and the sacrifice that might one day be required of him. As he approaches the door, the whispers begin again. They start as a soft murmur in the back of his mind, but then Luca's voice echoes in his ears once more, carrying a final warning, a reminder that the battle is far from over and the cycle of duty has begun again. Marco stands before the door, knowing that this night will mark the start of a journey that will define his life, his soul, and perhaps his very fate. The eternal vigilance of the Swiss Guard continues, the struggle against darkness never-ending. Marco's heart beat faster as he approached the Chamber of Silence for his first official night watch. The flickering torchlight cast long, jagged shadows along the stone corridor, making the ancient door before him seem even more imposing. He had seen it countless times during his training. This door, with its mysterious carvings and heavy, iron-reinforced wood, but tonight it felt different. Tonight he was the one standing guard. He had heard the stories of Luca Bellini ever since he had joined the Swiss Guard. Luca, the brave protector who had sacrificed his soul to imprison the ancient entity. Luca, whose name was whispered by the guards who came before him, whose sacrifice was etched into the history of the Vatican. But now, standing at his post, Marco realized the full weight of the responsibility that had been passed down to him. It was no longer a story. It was no longer something that was taught in the academy. It was real. Luca's legacy wasn't just about heroism, it was about duty. The sacrifice was not a one-time act. It was a cycle that had to be carried on from one generation of guards to the next. And now Marco was the one who would continue it. He was the guardian, just as Luca had been before him. And Marco stood in front of the chamber, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the cold door. He had trained for this moment. He had learned the rituals, the rules, the sacred traditions of the Swiss Guard. But nothing could have prepared him for the profound silence that pressed against him now, a silence that felt both heavy and alive. The whispers began soft at first, like the sound of wind moving through the cracks in the stone. Marco's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his chest. He had heard these whispers before in his first days of training, but tonight they were different. They were not just a sound, they were a presence. Luca Bellini, the whispering voice murmured, echoing through the chamber, distant but clear. Marco paused, his heart racing. The name sent a chill through his spine, and he instinctively took a step back. He had always been taught that the whispers were just a part of the chamber's mystery, something all guards had to endure. But tonight it felt personal. Tonight, the whispers weren't just a warning, they were a call. The whisper grew louder, more distinct until it seemed to surround Marco entirely. Luca Bellini, Luca Bellini. The cycle is never-ending. You are now bound. Marco's breath hitched as the voice, Luca's voice, reached him, not just as a whisper, but as a force. It was as if the very soul of Luca was reaching through the walls of the chamber, trying to communicate with him from beyond. Marco closed his eyes, trying to center himself, but the weight of Luca's words pressed against him. The darkness will rise again. The entity is never fully sealed. You will stand watch. You will guard, as I did. The price is high, but the duty is eternal. Be ready, Marco. You cannot escape your fate. The words echoed in Marco's mind, leaving him breathless. He opened his eyes and stared at the door. The whispers had stopped, but the presence remained, lingering like an oppressive fog. Marco felt a shiver run down his spine. The warning was clear. The darkness was not gone, it was just waiting, and it would return. He had always known the duty was eternal, but hearing Luca's voice, hearing the truth of what it meant to be a Swiss guard, was something else entirely. The Chamber of Silence was not just a place to protect. It was a prison, and its prisoner would one day return. Marco clenched his fists, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The legacy of Luca Bellini was now his. The sacrifice, the vigilance was passed on to him as it had been passed on to every guard who had come before him. Marco took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hand resting on the door of the chamber. The weight of the key was heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the responsibility he now carried. He had heard the stories, and now he was part of them. The cycle of duty and sacrifice had begun again. The silence of the chamber enveloped him, and for a moment, Marco thought he could feel Luca's presence beside him. He wasn't alone. The legacy of the Swiss guards, the legacy of Luca, was alive within him, and the duty would continue. There was no escape from it. The door creaked open as Marco inserted the key into the lock. He could feel the cold air from inside the chamber brush against his skin, and he knew that this was where his journey as a guardian would truly begin. The cycle of sacrifice, of guarding the sacred, of keeping the darkness at bay had never ended. It never would. And so, Marco stepped into the chamber, knowing that his fate was now tied to Luca Bellini's, and the eternal battle would continue, not just for him, but for every generation of guards to come.